We've had, as a result of the election broadcast, many thousands of telephone calls that we've dealt with in our Eastleigh office. In fact, so much so that we're keeping the office open for an extra month just to field all these calls. We will, between now and the end of the year, be setting up constituency associations across the country. So our job, I think, at this stage is structural, really.
You don't feel as though, in a sense, a one-issue party will rapidly disappear off the political scene?
No, I don't. How can this be a one-issue party? We're talking about whether we are in the future to control our own foreign policy, whether we are to control our own financial policy. Every aspect, every major aspect of our national life is under threat, or at least our ability to make decisions on them is under threat. So no, we are not a one-issue party. That having been said, we will have for the next general election a much broader manifesto, particularly on the economy, and we intend to put before the electorate a sensible plan of how we're going to raise money and how we're going to spend money. The other parties will fight the next general election telling you how much money they're going to spend, but won't tell you where it's going to come from. No, we are going to put that to the people next time round. So look for a much broader base on the UKIP.
Known UK Independence Party, or UKIP, are only 3 years old. They average just over 3% of the vote in the European elections, but they're planning to fight every seat at the general election. Fed up with what they regard as a pro-European conspiracy among the major parties, the UKIP believe their time has come.
What started as a murmur in the pubs and clubs and wherever people congregate in this country is now beginning to reach a crescendo roar. And what people are saying is, get Britain out.
I joined the Conservative Party when I was 13 or 14 years old. I was excited by much of what Mrs. Thatcher was trying to do during the 1980s. I felt that I was always going to be a Conservative, but it didn't seem possible to me that the Conservative Party would so actively betray all that this country stands for.
Mr. President, let me say right from the outset that the UK Independence Party, my party, the members of which who are so often dismissed as little Englanders, totally deplore the outbreaks of petty nationalism in the UK and France over this beef issue. However, I find it ironic that the EU institutions, which introduced the ban on British beef exports in 1996, and which exist to promote the unity and cooperation of European nations, have, by their original actions, created a political situation which has directly led to this disharmony. My party, which has a clear election manifesto to seek Britain's withdrawal from the EU, notes that if the Commission had not interfered in the first place back in 1996, individual nations would have been able to decide whether or not to buy British beef. At that time, a number of countries, particularly South Africa and Botswana, were willing to continue to buy British produce. Without the EU ban, Britain would have been free to exploit alternative markets and this crisis would not have arisen. Now we have a classic demonstration that membership of the EU is bad for British business. It affirms my belief that it's about time that my own country recognised that our interests are best served by not being a member of this club. Most people in the UK thought we joined a free trade area, but this crisis demonstrates it is anything but that. While the UK has obeyed EU law to the letter, other countries are running a cart and horse through the rulebook. The level playing field is about as level as the decks of the Titanic after it hit the iceberg. Thus, while I wish the Commissioner well in his endeavours, I am afraid that whatever he does, it will not be good enough. I, for one, will be urging my own government to leave this club and to rejoin the real trading world. Thank you. So what are MEPs for? Well, I'll tell you. MEPs are here to vote, and to vote often and to vote regularly. Sometimes we vote up to 450 times in the space of 80 minutes. Now, I have to confess, hands up, I don't know what's going on half the time. I haven't even read all of the documents, so massive are they. Now, it could be that my fellow MEPs down there are all Albert Einsteins and all absolutely understand what's going on. But I suspect that's not the case. In fact, it's rather like paying monkeys, because what happens is the civil servants draw up the list, and if it's vote number 58 and the piece of paper says vote yes, you vote yes, and if it's number 59 and it says vote no, you vote no. It is an absolute farce. it is a complete sham masquerading as democracy. Okay. In 15 minutes' time, we have to go down to the European Parliament and to fulfil our function as members of the European Parliament, which means we have to vote. So what we're about to do now is, with our assistants who've done a massive amount of reading and work behind the scenes, they are effectively going to tell us what to do. Look at how many votes there are. What have we got?
Yeah.
So there's about, in fact, now look at that. This is a classic example of EU voting. There we have 40 individual different amendments that we're expected to vote for en bloc. Now I defy any man or woman down in that chamber to understand all those 40 amendments and make a balanced decision. It's just impossible. And the other point, of course, is the sheer financial point, that this place is thick with institutional corruption. You could now buy a cheap airline ticket to come to Strasbourg for about £45 return. When you get here, you're reimbursed nearly £800 for the cost of that flight. Now, this has been going on for the last 20 years, and of course what's happened is that our members of the European Parliament simply haven't been talking about it. The system is fraudulent, it's rotten to the core. In 1998, a man called Paul van Buitenen, who worked in the European Commission, decided that fraud, waste, mismanagement, corruption and nepotism had become so bad that no longer could he hold his peace, and he went public and became the first whistleblower. It turned out that in fact all of his claims were right, and the entire European Commission were forced to resign in disgrace. The president of that commission, Jacques Santer, is now here as a member of the European Parliament for Luxembourg. And Commissioner Kinnock, who was one of the 20 that had to resign, is now a vice president of the European Union and has been put in charge of sorting out fraud. Well, how well has he done? Well, there's now another whistleblower. Her name's Marta Andreasen. She went to Commissioner Kinnock. She said, look, I'm sorry, Commissioner Kinnock, but I cannot sign off these accounts. You're using a cash-based system. You're not using double-entry bookkeeping, which incidentally was invented in the late 14th century. She said, I cannot sign off these accounts as being a true and accurate record of the EU's finances, and for her trouble, she's been suspended pending an investigation. Everybody talks about reforming fraud within the European Union. I think this whole system is so rotten that it's now unreformable. There's been a great debate going on for the last 5 years about the supposed benefits of the single currency. We're told that business needs it, and we're told above all that it's good for jobs. Well, how's it working out 3 years down the road? Well, in Germany, just 2 miles across the border, there are now 4.6 million people unemployed. They are experiencing exactly what we experienced during ERM back in the early 1990s. They cannot set their own interest rates to set their own economy. And the great risk of joining the euro is that you can finish up totally out of sync with the rest of the European economy, and there's nothing that your democratically elected government can do to alter it. Well, today the European Parliament has voted on the admission of 10 new member states. I have to tell you that I was one of only 22 members of a House out of 626 that voted for those countries not to join. I did so not just because it would save the British taxpayer a great deal of money if they didn't join. I did it for their sakes because most of these countries have just left a system of centralised, undemocratic communist government based in Soviet Russia, and I fear they're about to re-enter a very similar system. But I must say this to you, that not everything about this European project is bad news, because the really good news is there's something we can do about it. If we want to, and all we need is the political will, a British Parliament at any moment in time can vote for us to have an amicable divorce from this corrupt club. We can then renegotiate a genuine free trade agreement, which is what we thought we'd signed up to in the first place. And even here, commissioners like Kinnock and Patton and luminaries such as Giscard d'Estaing say that if Britain doesn't want to be part of this full political union at which they're attempting, we can, if we want, get out of it and renegotiate a free trade deal. We don't need to be in the EU to trade with the EU. That idea is anachronistic and dates back to the 1950s and 60s. So it really is up to us. But we have to do something about it. We have to vote for people who will not allow this continual surrender of our sovereignty to continue.
Señor Farage,
now Mr. Farage for the Independence and Democracy Group. For 2 minutes.
Prime Minister, 6 months ago you came here, you impressed everybody with your reform agenda, even me. I said if you achieved your goals, I would support you. Economic reform was the cry. And within a couple of weeks, the Commission had proposed to scrap 68 new laws. I thought, crikey, perhaps Blair's going to do it. Perhaps he really is going to reform and change. But no, under your presidency, there have been 3,350 new legislative acts. Total failure on economic reform. On the CAP, you said you'd work to achieve a consensus for reform. Well, in a way you have, I suppose, because you've got 24 countries against you. No CAP reform until 2014. On the budget, you said there'd be no surrender of the UK rebate. Well, it seems to me that you've given away £7 billion of British taxpayers' money for nothing in return. Your only achievement is to open talks with Turkey, which is opposed by the vast majority of people in Europe and will lead to an even higher bill. Why should British taxpayers pay for new sewers in Budapest, for a new underground system in Warsaw, when our own public services are crumbling in London? Why should we pay a penny piece into an organisation whose accounts have not been signed off by the auditors for the last 11 years in a row? This budget deal is game, set and match to President Chirac. No cheese-eating surrender monkey he. Unlike you, he stands up for the French national interest, not some bizarre notion of Europe, and he has outclassed and outplayed you at every turn. Your only real achievement is that Britain is now isolated, alienated. We are completely alone within the European Union, which is why it's been said before. Hang on a second. Everybody else gets an extra minute, Mr. President. I'm asking for 10 seconds. Thank you. Which is why, Prime Minister, I urge you. It's often been said that you wanted to be the permanent President of Europe. Please stay on for a further 6 months, 6 more months of the British presidency, and they'll kick us out. Thank you. I'm surprised we have the front to call this a debate, because the Minister didn't tell us any of the substance of the negotiations. But of course there is no debate, is there? No debate in the national parliaments, no informed opinion in the press, no debate at all. And why? Because this whole treaty is being put together in secret. And that is being done because you don't want to involve the citizens of Europe. You're fearful that the more they find out about your grandiose plans, the more likely they are to vote no. And what's worse still is the downright dishonesty with which this whole process is being pursued. For Angela Merkel, in a letter, to talk about the proposal, to use different terminology without changing the legal substance, I mean, it's Alice through the looking glass stuff, isn't it? It's the twisting of language. It is the deliberate attempt to stop there being free and fair referendums in European countries. It's your plan to act like a bulldozer, just to sweep aside the French referendum result, the Dutch referendum result, to pursue your political goals without taking the people with you. Well, I've no doubt you think that you're going to get away with it. But if you're proud of your European project, if you're true Democrats, then you join me in the call for let the people decide their own future. Don't foist it upon them. President Sarkozy, you have of course brought energy and dynamism to your presidency, but made clear at all stages that you want more power for the Union and that you want the Lisbon Treaty. With the Czech presidency about to take over, I think we've seen the true face of this modern-day European Union with the appalling attack on President Klaus. And I'm going to ask you, what kind of European Union do you want? Because what we've got here is a union that treats democracy with contempt. Brian Crowley said to President Klaus that the Irish wish for the Lisbon Treaty. Well, I'm sorry, old son, but they said no. Please accept the result. In previous times, Martin Schulz has stood up and said that a no vote will lead to fascism and that we must not bow to populism. So this is a union that despises democracy. And it's a union that cannot cope with any alternative point of view. I don't care about your opinions, is what Danny Cohn-Bendit said to President Klaus. And in previous times, Mr Cohn-Bendit has said in this chamber that opponents of this treaty are mentally ill. This is a very, very dangerous step for this union to be taking, and it's a union that behaves like a thug and a bully. And when Mr Cohn-Bendit put the European flag on President Klaus's desk and told him to fly it from the castle, he could just as well have been a German official from 70 years ago or a Soviet official from 20 years ago. Danny the libertarian, who is now the authoritarian, the man who has turned into everything he said he was opposed to 40 years ago, and this is the face, President Sarkozy, of this European Union. And all of it egged on by President Pottering, who in previous times has fined members of this House for insulting other heads of state. Mr Sarkozy, is this the kind of union that you want? Or will you join me in condemning the absolutely appalling treatment of President Klaus in Prague last week?
And unity. None but those on the political extremes would question that we are stronger together, safer together than ever we are apart.
Now, on behalf of the Independence and Democracy Group, Nigel Farage, 3 minutes.
Minister, you received some criticism this afternoon for your comment, British jobs for British workers, but you can brush that aside, because from the moment you said it, I don't think anybody seriously thought that you would ever, as a British Prime Minister, put the interests of British workers above that of your European dream. And my goodness me, you showed that this afternoon. It's just a pity that apart from UKIP, virtually nobody seems to bother to turn up to listen to you. No, you're very popular here. You're very popular indeed, because within a few days of the Irish saying no to the Lisbon Treaty, you had rammed that treaty through the British Parliament, and you'd done it breaking a specific... You see, I said you were popular. You did it breaking a specific manifesto pledge that you would give the British people a referendum on the constitutional treaty. Shame on you, Prime Minister, for doing that. You have devalued democracy in our country. You have devalued the trust that voters have got in you as a British Prime Minister. But of course we know the reason why. The reason why is that we would have voted no. Yes. You said in your speech that none but those on the extremes oppose European Union. Well, that may be right amongst professional career politicians, but a clear majority of the British people want us to have friendship and free trade with the European Union, but do not want to be members of this political union. You cannot continue against public opinion to build this European Union. If you do it against the will of the people, you are storing up enormous social and political problems for the future. Please, please, let the peoples of Europe decide their destiny. Don't have it done in parliaments like this and parliaments like Westminster. It won't work. And as far as the economy is concerned, you've told us that somehow you're the economic guru. You're the man that can save the world. Well, I remember very well your first big act as Chancellor, when you sold 400 metric tons of gold on the world's exchanges at $275 an ounce. At today's valuation, that would be $10 billion higher. But it isn't just the fact you got it wrong, because we can all get it wrong. It was the fact that you announced in advance how much you were going to sell and on what day you were going to sell it. It was an error so basic that the average A-level economics student, even in these educationally devalued times, wouldn't have done. To add to that, you've destroyed our private pension system. You took away from the Bank of England its ability to regulate the banks and gave it to the tick-box bureaucrats at the FSA in Canary Wharf. And we haven't heard an apology. Your government has apologised for the Amritsar massacre. You've apologised for slavery. You've apologised for virtually everything. Will you please apologise for what you did as British Chancellor, and then perhaps we might just listen to you. Thank you.
Leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, has been injured in a plane crash. The police say the accident happened at around 8 this morning, just west of Milton Keynes, near Brackley in Northamptonshire. Now, it's understood the plane had been trailing a banner and had only been in the air for some 10 minutes before it came down near the airfield. Mr. Farage has been taken to hospital at Banbury for a checkup. The pilot had to be cut from the wreckage, and he's been airlifted to hospital now in Coventry. Well, let's get the very latest. Lisa Dowd at the scene of the crash, Darren Little at the hospital where Mr. Farage is being treated. Lisa, first to you. I understand the air accident branch will be on its way, but clearly he is, and the pilot too, lucky to escape with their lives.
Well, we understand from a photographer, a member of UKIP who was here when the crash happened, that the aircraft had been in the air for around 10 minutes or so at around 8 o'clock this morning. It was flying at quite a low level over the airfield, around 10 to 15 metres from the ground. Now, police are telling us that they understand that the aircraft had been trying to land here, but at some point it flipped over and crashed to the ground, really crushing the cockpit and Nigel Farage and the pilot who were inside. It's really amazing to see that Nigel Farage managed to walk away from the cockpit with minor injuries. The pilot, though, was trapped inside for some time. He, though, managed to reach for his mobile phone and call the emergency services, giving them all the details they might need to know, even down to the finer details of the make and the model of the aircraft. So amazing really that either of them really survived this when you see the wreckage, and plenty here at the scene now for air accident investigators and police to do. They'll be looking at whether the banner which was trailing behind this aircraft played any part, whether it got tangled up in it, whether crosswinds might have played a part in the accident. We also know that this airfield was unfamiliar to the pilot, and we have been speaking to Detective Chief Inspector Martin Kitchen, and this is what he had to tell us.
I can confirm this morning at 8 o'clock the emergency services received a phone call as a result of a light aircraft coming down at this location. On arrival, emergency services have released the pilot from the plane, who was taken to Coventry Hospital at Wallsend by air ambulance. The passenger had been released prior to the arrival of emergency services and has been taken to hospital at Horton Hospital at Banbury. Investigations continue into the cause of the accident, and they will continue during the course of the rest of the day. We are in consultation with the Air Accident Investigation Board, who are providing us with advice at this time.
Well, what are the aftermath? Let's catch up with Darren at the hospital. Extraordinary, Darren, when we see these photos of Nigel Farage in that wreckage, that he managed to escape.
Oh, without doubt, and I'm told inside the hospital here, although he suffered relatively minor injuries, just minor facial injuries and some chest pains, which they are checking out to make sure everything's okay with his ribs and other things within his chest. He is traumatised and shocked by what has happened. Clearly, coming into such an impact at such a low level, that plane flipping, being trapped, and then having to crawl out and then see the pilot be cut out of that plane. He is quite in a degree of shock. We're not sure quite when he is going to leave the hospital here. Meanwhile, the pilot, as Lisa was saying, was conscious throughout. He was airlifted to the University Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire. We understand with leg and back injuries, slightly more serious, although we understand his injuries are not life-threatening. But when you see the state of that plane, an engine somewhere else on the airfield away from the main plane itself, really both of them have had a very, very lucky escape.
And do we know, Darren, if Mr. Farage has managed to help the inquiry as yet as to what may have gone wrong?
I think it's too early to say at the moment. There's certainly no police here or any investigators. I think they're just trying to get him patched up and then see where they go from here. We also don't know even whether he has voted today. I mean, clearly that was the intention of what he was doing, and we're not sure whether he will even be discharged today. It all really depends on the condition when they do those body scans and find out how he is in his entirety. But at the moment it sounds his mind is a long way from polling day. He's thinking about other things at the moment.
Yeah. Darren at the hospital and Lisa at the scene of the accident. Both, thanks very much indeed. Of course, more.
He's battered and bruised. But Nigel Farage is one politician whose election night misfortunes were eclipsed by the human drama he faced in the skies above Northamptonshire. 2 days on, he's still in pain, but hasn't lost his sense of humour.
I'm not even keen on flying. Part of this was to try and prove to myself that flying wasn't something to be scared of.
The wreckage of this light aircraft is a vivid reminder of just how fortunate the former UKIP leader and his pilot was to survive the impact. They'd been towing a Vote UKIP sign on Thursday morning when it became tangled in the tail.
As soon as we hooked onto this thing, he said, "This is an emergency," because the banner, it hadn't hooked up on a cord, something had got caught over the tail, so we sort of went up and spent the next 5 minutes waiting to crash.
After the plane struck the ground, the drama still wasn't over as both men were trapped in the crushed cockpit.
The next bit was worse, really, because there was a strong smell of petrol. I could feel petrol in my hair, and I was trapped in this thing. And I was talking to Justin, the pilot. We were saying to each other, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" But he was panicking then more than me because of the petrol. And I just this awful feeling that we survived the impact, but God, were we going to burn to death? And yeah, that's pretty scary.
And it was that brush with death which has put everything else into context. Nigel Farage lost his bid to become a Westminster MP on Thursday, but that disappointment has been tempered by the knowledge that at least he's still here to fight another day. Mark.
Morning, Mr Van Rompuy. You've been in office for 1 year, and in that time the whole edifice is beginning to crumble. There's chaos. The money's running out. I should thank you. You should perhaps be the pin-up boy of the Eurosceptic movement. But just look around this chamber this morning. Just look at these faces. Look at the fear. Look at the anger. Poor old Barroso here looks like he's seen a ghost. You know, they're beginning to understand that the game is up. And yet in their desperation to preserve their dream, they want to remove any remaining traces of democracy from the system. And it's pretty clear that none of you have learned anything. You know, when you yourself, Mr Van Rompuy, say that the euro has brought us stability, I suppose I could applaud you for having a sense of humour, but isn't this really just the bunker mentality? You know, your fanaticism is out in the open. You talked about the fact that it was a lie to believe that the nation state could exist in a 21st century globalised world. Well, that may be true in the case of Belgium, who haven't had a government for 6 months, but for the rest of us, right across every member state in this union, and perhaps this is why we see the fear in the faces, increasingly people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, we don't want this political class, we want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history. And we had the Greek tragedy earlier on this year, and now we have the situation in Ireland. Now I know that the stupidity and greed of Irish politicians has a lot to do with this. They should never ever have joined the euro. They suffered with low interest rates, a false boom and a massive bust. But look at your response to them. What they're being told, as their government's collapsing, is that it would be inappropriate for them to have a general election. In fact, Commissioner Wren here said they had to agree their budget first before they'd be allowed to have a general election. Just who the hell do you think you people are? You are very, very dangerous people indeed. Your obsession with creating this Euro state means that you're happy to destroy democracy. You appear to be happy for millions and millions of people to be unemployed and to be poor. Untold millions must suffer so that your Euro dream can continue. Well, it won't work, because it's Portugal next. With their debt levels of 325% of GDP, they're the next ones on the list, and after that I suspect it'll be Spain. And the bailout for Spain would be 7 times the size of Ireland, and at that moment all of the bailout money has gone. There won't be any more. But it's even more serious than economics, because if you rob people of their identity, if you rob them of their democracy, then all they are left with is nationalism and violence. I can only hope and pray that the euro project is destroyed by the markets before that really happens.
Co-President of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy, Nigel Farage. The floor is yours.
Well, here we are, on the edge of a financial and social disaster, and in the room today we have the 4 men who were supposed to be responsible. And yet we've listened to the dullest, most technocratic speeches I've ever heard. You are all in denial. By any objective measure, the euro is a failure. And who is actually responsible? And who's in charge out of you lot? Well, of course, the answer is none of you, because none of you have been elected, none of you actually have any democratic legitimacy for the roles that you currently hold within this crisis. And into this vacuum, albeit reluctantly, has stepped Angela Merkel. And we are now living in a German-dominated Europe. Something that the European project was actually supposed to stop. Something that those that went before us actually paid a heavy price in blood to prevent. I don't want to live in a German-dominated Europe, and nor do the citizens of Europe. But you guys have played a role. Because when Mr Papandreou got up and used the word referendum, or Mr Rehn, you described it as a breach of confidence, and your friends here got together like a pack of hyenas, rounded on Papandreou, had him removed and replaced by a puppet government. What an absolutely disgusting spectacle that was. And not satisfied with that, you decided that Berlusconi had to go. So he was removed and replaced by Mr Monti, a former European Commissioner, a fellow architect of this Euro disaster, and a man who wasn't even a member of the Parliament. It's getting like an Agatha Christie novel, where we're trying to sort of work out who's the next person that's going to be bumped off. The difference is we know who the villains are. You should all be held accountable for what you've done. You should all be fired. And I have to say, Mr Van Rompuy, 18 months ago when we first met, I was wrong about you. I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy, but you're not anymore. You're rather noisy about it, aren't you? You, an unelected man, went to Italy and said this is not the time for elections, but the time for actions. What in God's name gives you the right to say that to the Italian people?
Mr Farage.
Well, good morning, Mr Schulz. President Schulz, I know it's my job to congratulate you, but given that we knew this result 2.5 years ago as a result of a stitch-up, there really doesn't seem to be much point. I mean, after all, nobody in Europe would ever, modern-day Europe, would ever have a big, powerful job that was decided by a full, open process. I'm sure Mr Barroso would agree. I was musing this morning. I was thinking, what kind of President Schulz are we going to get? Are we going to get a dignified, calm, a figure that behaves like the Speaker of all great parliaments around the world, somebody who puts himself above politics and the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day arguments and is an ambassador, indeed a statesman? Or are we going to get the Martin Schulz we've got to know since 2004 as leader of the Socialist Group? You know the one I mean, snarling, angry, unable to control his temper, intolerant of anybody with an alternative point of view, somebody who is contemptuous when in free referendums people have the temerity to vote no, somebody who is anti-British to his fingertips and doesn't like free markets. I was wondering which one would we get. Well, your opening speech has settled that question for me, and it's pretty clear. We're going to have 2.5 years of political fanaticism from the chair. And I have to say, only a third world country, only a banana republic would want to have an overtly political president of a parliament. But it's what we've got. I may represent the smallest group in this parliament, Mr Schulz, but I can tell you that it's a group whose ideas and whose views are now being echoed by a growing number of citizens right across this continent. I'm sure you'd agree. The opinion polls show it's kind of 50-50 whether people think this EU is a good thing or a bad thing. What we represent, sir, is not anti-Europeanism. That is not what it's about. We believe in nation-state democracy. We want a Europe of trade. We want a Europe of cooperation. We want a Europe that is responsible. We don't want a Europe that seeks to be a global superpower. We don't want a Europe run by Mr Barroso and the Commission and the so-called community method. And I will do my very best to provide political opposition to your presidency over the course of the next 2.5 years, and I hope you give us a fair hearing. Thank you.
What are we doing here?
My point was, I mean, I don't want to live in the United States of Europe anyway, because I think that Europe has such different countries, different languages, different histories. But if you were going to build a United States of Europe, surely you wouldn't turn the clock back 1,000 years and abolish democracy and finish up with a president that had been appointed and who cannot be removed. And that was my basic point.
But you got penalized for those remarks.
Yes, they fined me. It was the maximum.
Who fined you?
The European Parliament themselves fined me, and it was the maximum fine that the
Which
Parliament
was what?
imposed. It was 3,000 euros.
And you paid it?
I paid it. I had no choice. They just docked it out of my money.
Really?
But yeah. And this brings into question...
For warning about the very things that are now causing riots across Greece and Europe today?
Oh, riots, and I think much worse to come, to be honest with you.
Why do you say that?
Listen, if you were Greek, I mean, the country that actually invented democracy, and I know the Greeks don't pay their taxes and they have a different culture, but Greece is now ruled by 3 foreign bureaucrats, one from the European Commission, one from the European Central Bank, and one from the IMF, an organisation who's, I'm afraid, gone downhill along with the European Commission.
The same IMF, by the way, that says the world's in for stinkier times, right?
Yes, it does say that today. But
that you agree with?
That I agree with, but what I find extraordinary is that America, of course, provides 18% of the money for the IMF, so American money is actually being used to prop up.
What would you tell us to do, Nigel?
I would say to you, get a grip. You are the biggest player with the IMF. Get a grip. Get rid of this awful woman, Christine Lagarde, who has turned the IMF effectively into an offshore post of the European Commission.
Well, she's been criticizing the way we conduct our fiscal policy in the United States. Some of the criticism was warranted, but she goes after the very people who are trying to correct it, which makes me think she's taking sides.
And paying her vast salary on which she pays no tax. You know, the great battle that's going on, and it's happening in America, it's happening in Europe, this battle of bureaucracy versus democracy, and I want to get democracy back. And people like Herman Van Rompuy and Christine Lagarde at the IMF should not be calling the shots.
You know, they all sound like Hans Christian Andersen characters, but I digress. Do you get a sense, though, that all the world has hit an inflection point? More government, less government. And that's same in the United States. That's the essence of our election 4 weeks from today. Or am I oversimplifying?
Well, the big difference is this. You actually have an election debate. You know, you can vote for a candidate that goes to Washington and fundamentally changes the tax structure, bureaucracy, the legislation in this country. What's happened in Europe is nation-state democracy has been subverted totally and given to people like the European president. And it doesn't matter how we vote in a British general election, because all we're doing is we're putting into 10 Downing Street a manager, a caretaker.
Yeah, but could I talk to you about some of these characters? You're a huge exception, my friend. They always blame us, like this Barrasso character. I want you to listen to this, because I know you have some strong views on this fellow. Some of you might be familiar.
This crisis was not originated in Europe. Since you mentioned North America, this crisis was originated in North America.
Idiot.
I thought he was an idiot too. Because here's the thing, he sounded French there. I know he's Portuguese, but I know he's lived all over Europe. But we consider him French with the attitude.
Could I just remind people, forget whether he's French, forget whether he's Portuguese. He's
condescending.
He's a former communist. All right?
Really?
So, yeah, he was a Maoist. You know, the most extreme form of communism. Nope. And the European...
I had my suspicions.
The European government is dominated by communists and dominated by people that hate...
Well, why can't guys like you get a role, a prominent role, instead of always being fined for speaking
I've got a prominent role.
I know that. You're here.
I'm one of the 7 group leaders in the European Parliament.
But their way is the winning way.
Well, at the moment, they've got the majority, but there is a democratic revolution taking place across Northern Europe. In a country like Finland, a party called the True Finns, who are against the bailouts and against this whole crazy system of surrendering democracy, nearly won the general election last year. My party, UKIP, back in the United Kingdom, we've now overtaken the Lib Dems, and we're 3rd in the polls. There is hope, there is optimism. All people need to do is to stand up and start voting differently.
Well, you know what makes you cool? I love people who put people down right in front of their faces.
I've never stabbed anybody in the back. I always do it in the front.
Everyone enjoys that except that Erwin Corey guy, but he...
well, he didn't like it, man.
No, he did not. Nigel Farage, thank you so much.
Thank you. With denial in this chamber this morning. There's been a major political event that's happened since we last met. No one's mentioned it. Italy had an election, and 55% of the electorate voted for Eurosceptic political parties. Indeed, Mr Grillo's movement managed to get 26%. It's quite tough in European politics these days to tell who the comedians are. And what's absolutely clear is that Eurozone membership is completely incompatible with nation-state democracy. You can do what you like to take away the powers of national parliaments, but people will go on voting, and I think there's a trend developing right across Europe that Eurosceptic parties are going to get stronger and stronger. And there's complete denial about the Eurozone crisis. You'd think, listening to everybody this morning, that it's over. You know, Mr Barroso comes out with a technocratic speech that everything's fine and dandy, mind you, far better than the unutterable drivel we had from Olli Rehn yesterday, which sent many members to sleep. But, you know, you're not facing up to the consequences for what you've done. Mr Verhofstadt talks about a lost generation in Spain. Mr Daul talks about youngsters struggling to be fed by their families in Greece. And all of that's true, but it's being caused by the euro, and that is what you're failing to recognise. The Eurozone has been a complete economic disaster, and the other thing that you're not ever going to face up to...
Herr Verhofstadt, trotzdem, Sie müssen sich... Mr Verhofstadt, please.
It's okay. The real problem that you won't face up to, though, is the state of the French economy, and the fact that France is now diverging by the month with Germany. So right at the very heart of the European project and the Eurozone project, there is a disaster coming down the tracks, and I'm afraid in the end the whole thing is going to break up. But I would also point out you're in denial over Romania and Bulgaria. Those countries are racked with corruption and organised crime. They should never have been allowed to join the European Union. And I want to make it absolutely clear, we in UKIP do not believe it's right and fair to have total open borders from next year for unlimited numbers of people from those countries to come to Britain to work, but also if they want to claim benefits. And as the results in the recent Eastleigh by-election showed, the British electorate are increasingly saying that enough is enough. It's not just us. The mayor of Duisburg in Germany has now publicly said that the massive influx from Romania and Bulgaria is causing huge social problems. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to face up to it. We should not be in political union with Romania and Bulgaria. We're going to get the biggest turnout in the European elections we've seen since 1979. So the answer is increasingly, yes, they do matter, and people realise that Europe, whether you like it or not, is really, really important. I think the allegations of the political establishment against us have stiffened people's resolve. 20 minutes ago, the immigration figures were out. 526,000 people settled in this country last year. It's just impossible. We cannot go on with numbers like that.
Excuse me, what are you doing?
First, with the results, Ed Conway is at the big screen.
Thank you very much, Adam. As you can see, I mean, all apart from London and Northern Ireland, obviously we're going to get Northern Ireland tomorrow, but all apart from London, all of these regions have declared, and I'll just take you through a few of these numbers that we already have, and as you can see, almost all of these have been declared. At the very bottom, you can see the number of MEPs who will be going to Brussels and Strasbourg. As you can see, the Tories with 17, Labour 16, the Lib Dems that one in the south east, sparing their blushes. UKIP with 23, as you can see, by far and away the most. And then what's in the other screen, we're just going to flick through to that. And you can see the Green Party with 2, the SNP with 2 as well, and Plaid Cymru with 1. So actually the Green Party with 1 more than the Lib Dems. Let's look through a few of the regions, because they have been coming in hard and fast recently. In the southeast, the biggest of all of the different regions of the UK. And again, some of these names very familiar indeed. Of course, Nigel Farage winning the first seat there. Dan Hannan from the Conservatives, but 4 seats there for UKIP and 1 for the Lib Dems. They're 1 MEP so far at least. And we can just see as well there 1 Green MEP as well. The North West is an area where Labour were hoping actually to come first, and they did indeed here. You can see Labour coming away with 3 MEPs, with the biggest share of the vote. UKIP there picking up 3 as well. Paul Nuttall, the deputy head of the party, there too. I want to show you the West Midlands as well, which is another one that we've had through relatively recently. You can see there UKIP with the biggest share of the vote and 3 of those MEPs, as opposed to the 2 from Conservative and 2 from the Labour Party as well. Just one thing I'm going to show you very quickly here. Let's go back and look at the South East. Look at the share of the vote for the Lib Dems there. Just an 8% share of the vote, down quite a bit, but that managed to pick them up 1 MEP there. Let's look at the Southwest. They didn't get an MEP here, but look at the number here. 10.7% share of the vote. They actually got more of a share of the vote in the Southwest, where they have tended to be very strong, in particular in Westminster.
Gentlemen, good evening. The People's Army of UKIP have spoken tonight and delivered just about the most extraordinary result that has been seen in British politics for 100 years, and I'm proud to have led them to that. And in a way, it's surprising it didn't happen before, because we've had 3 parties in British politics that have led us into a common market, that has developed into a political union, who've twisted and turned with a variety of promises to give us a referendum that they've never actually kept. And I think the penny's really dropped, that as members of this union, we can't run our own country, and crucially, we can't control our own borders. And far from this being something that is confined to people on the centre-right of politics, as the commentators would like you to believe, actually tonight in the North, we've bit very hard into the old Labour vote. We've almost topped the poll in Wales. We're going to make a breakthrough in Scotland, and we are genuinely a UK independence party, and we will go from here. Our People's Army will go from here to Newark, and we will go on next year to the general election with a targeting strategy, and I promise you this, you haven't heard the last of us. Thank you very much.
I'd like to give my customary welcome to incoming presidents of the European Council. I can see why they chose you. You're perfect. You're like the Euro record that's got stuck in the groove. Completely out-of-date view of what Europe is, and clearly you've learned absolutely nothing from the results of the European elections. Now, as you know, in the United Kingdom, immigration is the key debate. It is dominating political discourse within our country, and at the heart of that is the whole question of the free movement of peoples. But of course, your debate is the other side of the same coin. Your debate is about immigration, and time and again you've promised the Polish voters that young Poles would return to Poland, and at the same time Mr Cameron has promised the British people that fewer Poles would come to us. Well, it turns out that you've both been wrong, and that your country has been depopulated by 2 million people since you joined the European Union. And the reason is obvious. It's money, isn't it? And you yourself prove the point. You're the newest Polish emigre, and you've gone from a salary of 60,000 euros a year to a salary of 300,000 euros a year. So congratulations, you've hit the EU jackpot. But you've also scored a great victory without trying, because Mrs Merkel last week went to Downing Street. She spent a few hours with Mr Cameron, and Mr Cameron now is a big supporter of the free movement of people. Let me be clear, he said, I support the freedom of movement. So on that one, you've won a great victory against Mr Cameron without having to lift a finger. But he also says that he will now restrict the benefit of EU migrants working in Britain. Now, in the past, you've been very clearly opposed to this, and I want to please answer me today, Mr Tusk. Is it right that children who live in Warsaw should qualify for child benefit if their parents are working in London? Please clarify for me that point today. In some ways, you face quite a tough test. Not with the UK, our leaders are a soft touch. But despite the Lithuanian lemmings, you've got the euro crisis, you've got a referendum on whether the UK stays a member, and of course the appalling growth of attacks on Jewish people. I would put it to you, Mr Tusk, that the European elections showed us one thing, The voters in Europe want change. They want massive wholesale reform, and I'm entirely confident that you're not the man to provide that.
Referring to what Mr. Farage has said, I am impressed and satisfied. Ever since his famous speech 5 years ago here in this chamber about Herman van Rompuy, I have known that he is maybe the best example of political and personal culture and political decency and, you know, elegance. What can I say more? Yeah, I am really impressed, and keep it up, Mr. Farage.
On Monday, I will commence the process set out under our Referendum Act, and I will go to Parliament and propose that the British people decide our future in Europe through an in-out referendum on Thursday, the 23rd of June. The choice is in your hands, but my recommendation, I believe that Britain will be safer, stronger, better off in a reformed European Union.
The EFDD.
I'm looking forward to Guy Verhofstadt, the Liberal Group leader, coming to the United Kingdom to take part in the Brexit debate. Your passionate defence of a United States of Europe and a European army is, I know, sincerely held, and I'm sure the Liberal Democrats will be delighted. It's now been a month. It's now been a month since the last European summit.
Okay.
And you know, I don't know about a week being a long time in politics. There's been a sea change in that month, and I think that one event has woken people up to the folly of EU leaders, the Juncker Common Asylum Plan, the Merkel call, which led to a stampede. Those of us that have warned that unlimited numbers of people from different cultures without security checks would pose a threat to the cohesion of our societies were roundly abused for doing so. And then we came to New Year's Eve. Munich. The train station, the main station, closed down because of a terrorist threat, the intelligence coming from Syria and Iraq. The very same train station that in September people had stood at, holding up their placards, "Refugees welcome." That irony was not lost on me. But it's what happened, I think, in Cologne, where we saw the mob. Up to 1,000 young males in the street, sexually assaulting and harassing women. It is, I think, in many ways one of the most disgraceful public order events that we've seen in modern day Europe. And yet there was an attempt by the police and the press to cover it all up, and even the suggestion from some German politicians that German young women should change their dress and their mode of behaviour in the street, which I thought was a total insult. There's even a name for these assaults. A name for these assaults in Egypt, because they've now become commonplace and part of everyday life. And we ought to have the courage to send out a message to say these assaults must never be acceptable in any European town or city, and we'll do our damnedest to make sure that it never happens again. Now we go to the next European summit, and Mr. Cameron's going to conclude his renegotiation. I've no doubt there'll be a compromise on the fairly minor issue of migrant benefits. I've no doubt that he will come back from that summit with a few promissory notes for the future about Britain's relationship. But what he's not going to be talking about is our ability to get back control of our borders. And the British people know that those young men in Cologne, in a few years' time, will have EU passports and be free to come to Britain. And just to give you an idea of how big the sea change has been, a Daily Telegraph commentator, Alison Pearson, who had said she was undecided on Brexit, she didn't have enough information, wrote this the other day. She said, after Cologne, the EU referendum is about nothing less than the safety and security of British women. We, the Euro clueless, need to woman up and vote for the right of our daughters and granddaughters to live as they choose and to smile in the street. No more Mrs. Don't Know, let's get the hell out. I hope 2016 is our year of deliverance.
We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to vote to take back the independence, self-governance and control of this country's laws, of this country's courts, and crucially, of this country's borders. When a European law is made, there is nothing that you, the voters, the House of Commons, or the British government can do to reverse a single piece of European legislation.
In many we come to the moment of the vote. Remain, leave, or undecided. Can I ask, first of all, who is still undecided? A good few is the answer. Who wants to vote to leave? And who wants to vote to remain? Well, the leaves have it. The leaves have it. Thank you.
This is Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP.
That the dawn is breaking on an independent, united kingdom. If the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. We have fought against the multinationals, we fought against the big merchant banks, we fought against big politics, we fought against lies, corruption and deceit, and today honesty, decency and belief in nation, I think now is going to win. And we will have done it. We will have done it without having to fight, without a single bullet being fired. We'd have done it by damned hard work on the ground, by people like my friend Mr. Banks here. And by people in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and UKIP and of no party who've taken part in this campaign. And we'll have done it not just for ourselves, we'll have done it for the whole of Europe. I hope this victory brings down this failed project and leads us to a Europe of sovereign nation states, trading together, being friends together, cooperating together, and let's get rid of the flag, the anthem, Brussels, and all that has gone wrong. Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Morning.
The sun has risen on an independent, united kingdom. And just look at it, even the weather's improved. It's been a hell of a long journey, this. I first got involved in Eurosceptic politics 25 years ago, and the first election I contested, I managed to beat the late, great, screaming Lord Such by 164 votes, so I didn't come last. And now there are 17 million people that voted for Brexit. It's a victory for ordinary people, decent people. It's a victory against the big merchant banks, against the big businesses and against big politics. And I'm proud of everybody that had the courage, in the face of all the threats, everything they were told, they had the guts to stand up and do the right thing. The election was won, in my view, in the Midlands and the North, and I think it was the old Labour vote that came to us, and we, particularly as a party, campaigned as hard as we could in those areas. There is still a massive disconnect between Westminster, SW1 and real communities, and the one image I will remember throughout the rest of my life was a woman in Bolton grabbing my hands with tears in her eyes saying, "Why doesn't David Cameron, why doesn't the government come and see what they've done to my community, what they've done to the prospects for my kids?" People here don't understand. They're too wealthy. They don't get what open door mass immigration as a result of EU membership has done to people's wages, to people's availability of getting GP appointments or their kids into local schools. This was the issue ultimately that won this election. So I'm thrilled that we've done this. I believe the other big effect of this election is not what's happened in Britain, but what will happen in the rest of Europe. I mean, in the rest of the EU, Eurosceptic parties never talked about leaving the EU, now they are. An opinion poll in the Netherlands said that a majority there now want to leave. So we may well be close, perhaps, to Nexit. And similarly in Denmark, a majority there are in favour of leaving, so we could be quite close to Dexit. And I'm told the same may apply to Sweden and perhaps Austria and perhaps even Italy too. The EU's failing, the EU's dying. I hope we've knocked the first brick out of the wall. I hope this is the first step towards a Europe of sovereign nation states, trading together, neighbours together, friends together, but without flags, anthems or useless old unelected presidents. So what happens now? What happens next? Well, 17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship. A government that'll be mindful that already many of the German car manufacturing unions have said, let's get on and do a deal. Let's go on selling motor cars and wine and cheese with each other. But a government also that at the same time uses the opportunity of Brexit. And the opportunity is we're now freed to start making our own trade deals and associations with the rest of the world. We've left behind, with this result, we've left behind a failing political union. We've given ourselves the chance to rejoin the world in a 21st century global economy. So we need, as I say, a Brexit government. We need the negotiations to start as soon as humanly possible. We need to start thinking globally about our future. And the other thing I think that needs to happen is that June the 23rd needs to become a national bank holiday, and we will call it Independence Day. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Funny, isn't it? Funny, isn't it? Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. How things have changed.
Eine Sekunde bitte. Sekunde bitte. Kolleginnen und Kollegen, eine große Qualität der Demokratie ist, dass man auch denen zuhört, deren Meinung man nicht teilt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schulz. Isn't it funny? You know, when I came here 17 years ago, and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you? And the reason you're so upset, the reason you're so angry, has been perfectly clear from all the angry exchanges this morning. You, as a political project, are in denial. You're in denial that your currency is failing. You're in denial. Well, just look at the Mediterranean. No. As a policy to impose poverty on Greece and the rest of the Mediterranean, you've done very well. And you're in denial over Mrs. Merkel's call last year for as many people as possible to cross the Mediterranean into the European Union has led to massive divisions between countries and within countries. But the biggest problem you've got, and the main reason the United Kingdom voted the way that it did, is you have, by stealth, by deception, without ever telling the truth to the British or the rest of the peoples of Europe, you have imposed upon them a political union. You've imposed upon them a political union. And when the people in 2005 in the Netherlands and France voted against that political union, when they rejected the Constitution, you simply ignored them and brought the Lisbon Treaty in through the back door. What happened last Thursday was a remarkable result. It was indeed a seismic result, not just for British politics, for European politics, but perhaps even for global politics too, because what the little people did, what the ordinary people did, what the people who have been oppressed over the last few years and seen their living standards go down, they rejected the multinationals, they rejected the merchant banks, they rejected big politics, and they said, actually, we want our country back, we want our fishing waters back, we want our borders back, we want to be an independent, self-governing, normal nation, and that is what we have done, and that is what must happen. And in doing so, we now offer a beacon of hope to Democrats across the rest of the European continent. I'll make one prediction this morning: the United Kingdom will not be the last member state to leave the European Union. So the question is, what do we do next? Now, it is up to the British government to invoke Article 50, and I have to say that I don't think we should spend too long in doing it. I totally agree, Mr. Juncker, that the British people have voted. We need to make sure that it happens. But what I would like to see is a grown-up and sensible attitude to how we negotiate a different relationship. Now I know that virtually none of you have ever done a proper job in your lives, or worked in business, or worked in trade, or indeed ever created a job. But listen, just listen. Now, you're quite right, Mr. Schulz. UKIP used to protest against the establishment, and now the establishment protests against UKIP. So something has happened here. Let us listen to some simple, pragmatic economics. Between your countries and my country, we do an enormous amount of business in goods and services. That trade is mutually beneficial to both of us. That trade matters. If you were to decide to cut off your noses, to spite your faces, and to reject any idea of a sensible trade deal, the consequences would be far worse for you than it would be for us. And even no deal is better for the United Kingdom than the current rotten deal that we've got. But if we were to move to a position where tariffs were reintroduced on products like motor cars, then hundreds of thousands of German workers would risk losing their jobs. So why don't we just be pragmatic, sensible, grown up, realistic, and let's cut between us a sensible tariff-free deal, and thereafter recognise that the United Kingdom will be your friend, that we will trade with you, we will cooperate with you, we will be your best friends in the world. But do it sensibly, and allow us to go off and pursue our global ambitions and future. Thank you. The London stock market's rallying strongly this morning. It is now 12% up since its February lows. Sterling is weak, but then it started declining from July 2014, and the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand are now vying for who can be the first country from outside the EU to do a trade deal with the United Kingdom. Things are looking pretty good. The only upheaval is political upheaval, where we've seen a Prime Minister resign, and indeed the British Commissioner, Lord Hill, resign. They've both done so, I think, for the right reasons. You never know, we may be getting rid of a Labour Party leader as well. But upheavals in politics can actually be a very healthy and a very good thing. And I got into politics because our political class in Britain led us towards a European political project. So if that result last week sweeps a few of them away, so be it. But I am looking forward next year to celebrating our Independence Day on June the 23rd.